In just 100 days, nearly 1 million people were murdered, not by bombs or bullets from a distant army, but by their own neighbors, friends, and sometimes even family members. Machetes, clubs, and bare hands became weapons of mass destruction. Radio stations became instruments of death, broadcasting kill lists and locations where people were hiding. Churches, schools, and hospitals, places meant for sanctuary, became slaughterhouses. This happened in 1994, not centuries ago. This was the Rwandan Genocide, and it stands as one of the most savage reminders that evil can spread faster than wildfire when good people choose to do nothing. If this story moves you, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to understand this history. Your support helps us bring these crucial stories to light. Don't forget to subscribe for more content that matters. Rwanda's path to genocide began long before 1994. The seeds of hatred were planted and carefully watered for decades, creating the perfect storm for mass murder. Before European colonization, Rwanda was home to three main groups: the Hutu, who made up about 85% of the population and were primarily farmers; the Tutsi, who comprised about 14% and were traditionally cattle herders; and the Twa, a small minority of about 1%. These groups shared the same language, culture, and religious beliefs. They intermarried freely, and social mobility between groups was common. A Hutu could become a Tutsi by acquiring cattle, and a Tutsi could become a Hutu by losing their wealth. The arrival of German colonizers in the 1890s, followed by Belgian control after World War I, changed everything. The Europeans brought with them racial theories that would poison Rwandan society for generations. They viewed the Tutsi as a superior race, describing them as naturally born rulers with more European-like features. The Hutu were characterized as an inferior peasant class, meant to serve their Tutsi masters. The Belgians institutionalized this racial hierarchy through their colonial administration. They issued identity cards that permanently fixed ethnic categories, making it impossible for people to change their social status as they had done for centuries. The Tutsi were given privileged access to education and government positions, while the Hutu majority was systematically excluded from power. This colonial manipulation created deep resentment among the Hutu population. What had once been fluid social categories became rigid ethnic identities. The Belgians had taken a society with economic and social differences and transformed it into one divided by race and hatred. By the 1950s, a new generation of educated Hutu began to challenge Tutsi dominance. They formed political organizations and demanded equal rights. The Catholic Church, which had initially supported Tutsi rule, began to support Hutu emancipation. In 1957, Hutu intellectuals published the Hutu Manifesto, which framed their struggle in racial terms and called for the overthrow of Tutsi rule. The Belgian colonial authorities, sensing the changing winds, switched their support from the Tutsi to the Hutu majority. This shift in colonial backing had devastating consequences. In 1959, violent clashes erupted between Hutu and Tutsi communities. Thousands of Tutsi were killed, and many more fled to neighboring countries. This violence, known as the Hutu Revolution, established a pattern of ethnic killing that would repeat itself for decades. When Rwanda gained independence in 1962, it was under Hutu rule. The first president, Gregoire Kayibanda, promoted a policy of Hutu power that systematically discriminated against the Tutsi minority. Quotas were established limiting Tutsi access to education and employment. Periodic massacres drove more Tutsi into exile, creating a large refugee population in neighboring countries. In 1973, Major General Juvenal Habyarimana, a Hutu from the north, seized power in a military coup. While his regime was initially more moderate towards the Tutsi, it still maintained the system of ethnic discrimination. Habyarimana's government was dominated by a small circle of Hutu elites from his home region, creating additional divisions within Rwandan society. The economic situation in Rwanda during the 1980s and early 1990s made ethnic tensions worse. The country was one of the most densely populated in Africa, with most people depending on small-scale farming. A drop in coffee prices, Rwanda's main export, caused economic hardship. Competition for land and resources increased, and politicians began to blame the Tutsi minority for the country's problems. Meanwhile, the children of Tutsi refugees who had fled earlier violence were growing up in exile. In Uganda, many joined the National Resistance Army and gained military experience. In 1987, they formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, with the goal of returning to Rwanda and establishing a democratic government. On October 1, 1990, the RPF launched an invasion of Rwanda from Uganda. This attack marked the beginning of a civil war that would last for nearly 4 years. The invasion provided Hutu extremists with the perfect excuse to portray all Tutsi as accomplices of the enemy. Radio stations began broadcasting anti-Tutsi propaganda, calling them cockroaches and snakes that needed to be eliminated. The war also led to the creation of extremist Hutu organizations. The Interahamwe, which means those who work together in Kinyarwanda, was formed as the youth wing of Habyarimana's party. Members received military training and were taught to view Tutsi as enemies who needed to be destroyed. Similar militia groups were formed by other Hutu political parties. Radio stations, particularly radio television, Libre des Mille Collines, RTLM, became powerful tools for spreading hatred. They broadcast folk songs that promoted anti-Tutsi sentiment and aired programs that dehumanized the Tutsi population. The station's announcers spoke in a casual, friendly manner that made their messages of hate seem normal and acceptable. International pressure led to peace negotiations between the government and the RPF. In August 1993, the Arusha Accords were signed, establishing a framework for peace and power sharing. However, Hutu extremists opposed these agreements, viewing them as a betrayal of the Hutu revolution. They began to plan a final solution to the Tutsi question. Throughout 1993 and early 1994, weapons were distributed to militia groups and civilian populations. Lists of Tutsi to be killed were compiled and distributed. Training sessions taught ordinary citizens how to use machetes and other weapons effectively. The stage was set for genocide. The assassination of President Juvenal Habyarimana on April 6, 1994, provided the trigger that extremists had been waiting for. At 8:20 p.m., as the president's plane approached Kigali airport, it was shot down by 2 surface-to-air missiles. Habyarimana was killed instantly, along with Burundian President Cyprien Ntaryamira, who was traveling with him and all other passengers on board. The identity of those responsible for shooting down the plane remains a subject of debate. Hutu extremists immediately blamed the RPF, while others suspected that the extremists themselves carried out the assassination to provide a pretext for genocide. What is certain is that the death of the president was the signal for which the killers had been waiting. Within hours of the plane crash, roadblocks appeared throughout Kigali. The Presidential Guard and other elite military units began systematic killings of Tutsi civilians and moderate Hutu politicians. Radio RTLM announced the president's death and began broadcasting calls for revenge against the Tutsi population. The killings started with prominent Tutsi and moderate Hutu leaders. Prime Minister Agatha Uwilingiyimana, a moderate Hutu woman, was murdered along with her husband and children. 10 Belgian peacekeepers who had been protecting her were also killed. Opposition politicians, journalists, human rights activists, and anyone who had supported the peace process were targeted for elimination. The Interahamwe and other militia groups swung into action with military precision. They had been preparing for this moment for months. Weapons caches were opened, and militia members distributed guns, grenades, and machetes to civilian supporters. The killers moved through neighborhoods with lists of targets, going door to door in search of Tutsi families. The efficiency of the killing operation was chilling. The extremists had divided the country into zones, with each area assigned to specific militia groups. Local officials, including mayors and police chiefs, coordinated the massacres in their areas. Government vehicles and fuel were provided to transport killers to different locations. Radio stations played a central role in directing the genocide. RTLM broadcasters read out names and addresses of people to be killed. They provided real-time updates on the progress of the killings and urged listeners to intensify their efforts. The station's announcers used coded language, referring to work that needed to be completed and weeds that needed to be cleared. The killing spread rapidly from Kigali to other parts of the country. By April 7th, massacres were taking place in multiple provinces. The genocidaires used Rwanda's efficient administrative system to implement their plan. Orders came from the capital and were passed down through regional, provincial, and local authorities. One of the most disturbing aspects of the genocide was how quickly ordinary citizens became killers. Neighbors turned on neighbors, teachers killed students, and church leaders murdered their congregations. The years of propaganda and ethnic indoctrination had created a population ready to participate in mass murder. The killers used various methods to identify their victims. The ethnic identity cards introduced by the Belgians made it easy to separate Hutu from Tutsi. Those who had lost their cards were subjected to physical examinations, with killers looking for supposed ethnic characteristics. Children were not spared. Killers believed that young Tutsi would grow up to seek revenge. The genocide was not a spontaneous explosion of ethnic hatred, but a carefully planned and executed campaign of extermination. The speed and efficiency of the killing operation demonstrated the extent of the preparation that had taken place. Within days, the machinery of genocide was operating at full capacity across the country. The Rwandan Genocide stands as one of the most intense periods of killing in human history. In just 100 days, between 800,000 and 1 million people were murdered. This means that every day, for more than 3 months, between 8,000 and 10,000 people were killed. The pace of killing was actually faster than the Holocaust. The primary weapon used in the genocide was the machete. These agricultural tools were imported in large quantities in the months leading up to the killing. Unlike guns or bombs, machetes required killers to get close to their victims, making the murders intensely personal and brutal. The use of traditional weapons also meant that the killing was labor-intensive, requiring the participation of hundreds of thousands of people. Survivors' testimonies reveal the horrific nature of the violence. Families were forced to watch as their loved ones were hacked to death. Children were killed in front of their parents, and parents were murdered while their children watched. Pregnant women were cut open, and their unborn babies were killed. The killers showed no mercy to anyone, regardless of age or gender. Marie-Aimée Uvimana, a survivor from Butare, described how militia members came to her home. "They broke down the door and dragged my husband outside. They made me watch as they cut off his hands and feet with machetes. Then they did the same to my 3 children. They left me alive so I would suffer." The genocide took place in public spaces where people had sought refuge. Churches, schools, stadiums, and government buildings became sites of mass murder. The killers knew that Tutsi would flee to these locations, and they were ready for them. At Nyarubuye Church, over 20,000 people were killed in a single day. The church grounds were covered with corpses, and the smell of death could be detected from miles away. One of the most notorious massacre sites was the Murambi Technical School, where over 50,000 people had taken refuge. Government officials had directed people to gather there, promising them protection. Instead, it became a trap. The killers surrounded the school and used grenades and machetes to murder everyone inside. Today, the preserved remains of victims are displayed at the site as a memorial. The killers used rape as a weapon of genocide. Women and girls were systematically sexually assaulted before being murdered. Many were kept alive for days or weeks as sex slaves before being killed. The use of rape was intended to destroy the dignity of victims and to ensure that any children born would be of mixed ethnicity, thereby diluting the Tutsi population. Survivors often describe the dehumanizing language used by the killers. Tutsi were referred to as cockroaches, snakes, and rats that needed to be exterminated. This language made it easier for ordinary people to participate in the killing by portraying the victims as less than human. The genocide also involved extensive looting and destruction of property. After killing Tutsi families, the perpetrators would take their belongings, including land, cattle, and household items. This economic motivation encouraged participation in the genocide, as people saw opportunities to improve their material circumstances. Children were both victims and perpetrators of the genocide. Thousands of children were killed, often in the most brutal ways. However, some children also participated in the killing, either voluntarily or under coercion. Child soldiers were recruited by both sides of the conflict, and many were forced to kill members of their own families to prove their loyalty. The psychological impact on survivors was devastating. Those who managed to hide or escape often suffered from severe trauma. Many had witnessed the murder of their entire families and felt overwhelming guilt about surviving. The breakdown of social bonds and trust made it difficult for survivors to rebuild their lives. Bodies were disposed of in various ways. Some were thrown into rivers, where they floated downstream into neighboring countries. Others were buried in mass graves or left to decompose in the open. The sheer number of corpses created public health problems and made it difficult to dispose of all the remains. The international media initially struggled to convey the scale and intensity of the killing. Early reports described the violence as ethnic clashes or civil war, failing to capture the systematic nature of the genocide. It was only after weeks of killing that the international community began to understand the true nature of what was happening in Rwanda. The genocide created a massive refugee crisis. Millions of Rwandans fled to neighboring countries, including Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo, Tanzania, and Uganda. Refugee camps became overcrowded and unsanitary, leading to disease outbreaks that killed thousands more people. The refugee crisis destabilized the entire region and contributed to ongoing conflicts. The international community's response to the Rwandan genocide represents one of the most shameful chapters in modern diplomatic history. Despite clear evidence of systematic mass killing, world leaders failed to act decisively to stop the genocide or protect the victims. The United Nations had peacekeeping forces in Rwanda at the time the genocide began. The United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, UNAMIR, was established in 1993 to monitor the implementation of the Arusha Accords. The mission was led by Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, who had repeatedly warned of the possibility of genocide. In January 1994, 3 months before the genocide began, General Dallaire sent a fax to UN headquarters in New York, warning of plans for mass killing. He had received information from an informant about weapon caches and hit lists. Dallaire requested permission to raid the weapons stores, but his request was denied by UN officials who were concerned about exceeding the mission's mandate. When the genocide began, UNAMIR had approximately 3,500 peacekeepers in Rwanda. However, these forces were poorly equipped and had a limited mandate that did not allow them to intervene to stop the killing. The rules of engagement prevented peacekeepers from using force except in self-defense. The murder of 10 Belgian peacekeepers on April 7, 1994, led to a rapid withdrawal of international forces. Belgium immediately pulled out its contingent, and other countries followed suit. Rather than reinforcing the mission, the UN Security Council voted to reduce UNAMIR's strength to just 270 personnel. This withdrawal occurred at the worst possible moment. General Dallaire later estimated that a force of just 5,000 well-equipped troops could have stopped the genocide. Instead, the international community chose to abandon Rwanda at its moment of greatest need. The United States, still traumatized by the loss of soldiers in Somalia the previous year, was particularly reluctant to intervene. The Clinton administration avoided using the word genocide in official communications, knowing that this would trigger legal obligations to intervene under international law. State Department officials were instructed to refer to acts of genocide rather than genocide itself. President Bill Clinton later acknowledged that the failure to act in Rwanda was one of the biggest regrets of his presidency. In 1998, during a visit to Rwanda, he apologized for the international community's inaction, saying, "We did not act quickly enough after the killing began. We should not have allowed the refugee camps to become safe haven for the killers." France's role in Rwanda was particularly controversial. The French government had been a strong supporter of the Habyarimana regime and had provided military training and weapons to the Rwandan army. When the genocide began, France initially maintained its support for the government forces. In June 1994, as the RPF was gaining control of the country, France launched Operation Turquoise, ostensibly a humanitarian mission to protect civilians. However, critics argued that the operation was actually designed to help the genocidaires escape justice. The French-controlled safe zone in southwestern Rwanda became a haven for fleeing killers. The media coverage of the genocide was initially inadequate and often inaccurate. Many news organizations were slow to recognize the systematic nature of the killing and continued to describe it as ethnic violence or civil war. This mischaracterization made it easier for politicians to avoid taking action. Some journalists, however, did provide excellent coverage of the genocide. Reporters like Philip Gurevich and Fergal Keane documented the horror and brought international attention to the crisis. Their work helped ensure that the genocide would not be forgotten. The Catholic Church's response to the genocide was deeply problematic. While some individual priests and nuns showed courage in protecting potential victims, the institutional church largely failed to speak out against the killing. Some church leaders even participated in the genocide, using their positions to lure victims to their deaths. The genocide finally ended in July 1994, when the RPF military victory drove the genocidal government from power. The RPF, led by Paul Kagame, established a new government committed to national unity and reconciliation. However, the international community's failure to prevent the genocide had already cost nearly 1 million lives. In the aftermath of the genocide, the international community established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR, to prosecute those responsible for the crimes. The tribunal, based in Arusha, Tanzania, successfully prosecuted many of the genocide's leaders, including former Prime Minister Jean Kambanda, who became the first head of government to be convicted of genocide. The United Nations also undertook a comprehensive review of its peacekeeping operations in response to the failures in Rwanda. The Brahimi Report, published in 2000, recommended significant reforms to make peacekeeping more effective in protecting civilians. The principle of responsibility to protect was adopted by the UN in 2005, partly in response to the failures in Rwanda. This principle holds that when states fail to protect their populations from mass atrocities, the international community has a responsibility to intervene. Despite these reforms, the international community has continued to struggle with preventing and responding to mass atrocities. The ongoing conflicts in Syria, Myanmar, and other countries demonstrate that the lessons of Rwanda have not been fully learned. The Rwandan genocide left scars that extend far beyond the immediate loss of life. The social fabric of the country was torn apart, families were destroyed, and an entire generation grew up traumatized by violence. However, Rwanda's recovery in the decades since 1994 has been remarkable, offering both hope and important lessons for the world. The immediate aftermath of the genocide was catastrophic. The country's infrastructure was destroyed, its economy was in ruins, and its institutions had collapsed. Nearly half the population had been killed, displaced, or had fled the country. Those who remained were deeply traumatized and faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding their lives and their nation. The new government, led by the RPF, made national unity and reconciliation its top priority. President Paul Kagame and his administration implemented policies designed to heal ethnic divisions and create a new Rwandan identity. The government banned ethnic identification and made it illegal to speak of Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa identities in public. All citizens were to be simply Rwandans. One of the most innovative approaches to dealing with the genocide's legacy was the revival of traditional justice mechanisms. The government established a network of Gacaca courts, community-based tribunals that allowed survivors and perpetrators to confront each other directly. These courts processed over 1 million cases and played a crucial role in revealing the truth about what happened during the genocide. The Gacaca process was not without controversy. Some survivors felt that it was too lenient on perpetrators, while others worried that it reopened old wounds. However, most observers agree that the process was essential for establishing the facts about the genocide and beginning the process of reconciliation. Rwanda's economic recovery has been impressive. The country has experienced sustained economic growth, with GDP per capita increasing dramatically since 1994. The government has invested heavily in education, healthcare, and infrastructure, transforming Rwanda into one of the most developed countries in East Africa. The education system has been completely reformed, with English replacing French as the language of instruction and a new curriculum that emphasizes science, technology, and critical thinking. The government has also promoted gender equality, and Rwanda now has the highest percentage of women in parliament of any country in the world. Rwanda's healthcare system has also improved dramatically. The country has achieved remarkable progress in reducing infant mortality, increasing life expectancy, and controlling diseases like malaria and HIV/AIDS. The government's focus on preventive healthcare and community-based health insurance has made medical care accessible to all citizens. However, Rwanda's post-genocide development has not been without criticism. Some observers argue that the government's authoritarian approach has stifled political dissent and limited freedom of expression. Critics point to restrictions on media freedom, the treatment of opposition politicians, and the lack of space for civil society organizations. The question of memory and memorialization has been central to Rwanda's recovery. The government has established numerous genocide memorials throughout the country, preserving sites where massacres occurred and displaying the remains of victims. These memorials serve both as places of remembrance and as educational tools for future generations. The annual commemoration period in April, known as Kwibuka, brings the country together to remember the victims and reflect on the lessons of the genocide. During this time, survivors share their testimonies, and the entire nation participates in activities designed to honor the dead and promote unity. Rwanda's experience has influenced international efforts to prevent genocide and mass atrocities. The country has become a strong advocate for the responsibility to protect doctrine and has contributed troops to peacekeeping missions in other countries. Rwanda's leaders argue that their experience gives them special insights into preventing and responding to mass violence. The country has also become a center for genocide studies and prevention. The Institute for Research and Dialogue for Peace in Rwanda conducts research on conflict prevention and reconciliation. International scholars and policymakers regularly visit Rwanda to learn from its experience. However, questions remain about the sustainability of Rwanda's model. Some experts worry that the emphasis on unity and the suppression of ethnic discourse may be masking underlying tensions rather than resolving them. Others question whether the country's economic success is benefiting all citizens equally. The regional dimensions of the genocide's legacy continue to affect Central and East Africa. The presence of genocidaires in refugee camps in eastern Congo contributed to ongoing conflicts in that region. The pursuit of those responsible for the genocide has created tensions between Rwanda and its neighbors. Despite these challenges, Rwanda's transformation since 1994 has been remarkable. The country has shown that it is possible to recover from even the most devastating violence and to build a more just and prosperous society. The lessons of Rwanda's experience, both the horrors of the genocide and the achievements of the recovery, continue to resonate around the world. The most important lesson of the Rwandan genocide is that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary evil when hatred is allowed to flourish unchecked. The genocide was not the result of ancient ethnic hatreds, but of deliberate manipulation by political leaders who used division and fear to gain and maintain power. The genocide also demonstrates the importance of international vigilance and action. The failure of the international community to prevent or stop the genocide shows the deadly consequences of indifference and inaction. The lesson is clear. When people are at risk of mass violence, the world cannot afford to look away. Finally, Rwanda's recovery shows that even after the most devastating violence, reconciliation and rebuilding are possible. The country's experience offers hope that other societies torn apart by conflict can find ways to heal and move forward. However, this process requires strong leadership, innovative approaches, and the commitment of all members of society. The Rwandan genocide remains a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for both evil and redemption. It challenges us to remain vigilant against hatred and division, to speak out when we see injustice, and to work together to build a more just and peaceful world. The victims of the genocide must never be forgotten, and their memory must inspire us to ensure that such horrors never happen again. The story of Rwanda teaches us that silence in the face of evil is complicity. If this narrative has opened your eyes to the importance of remembering and learning from history, please like this video and share it with others. Your engagement helps ensure these crucial stories reach more people. Subscribe to our channel for more content that confronts difficult truths and honors the memory of those who suffered. Together, we can make sure that never again becomes more than just words. It becomes our commitment to humanity.